Hello lovely people, welcome to my autumn reading wrap-up.
Doobie 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 doo. Doobie 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 Sophie Vlogs.
At the start of autumn, I set myself a TBR of books that I felt like I would be in the mood for. There's always certain genres that I'm drawn to in autumn, mainly like mystery and gothic things. I haven't managed to read everything that was on this list, but I thought I would just wrap up everything that I have managed to get to. I'm going to start off with My Cousin Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Du Maurier is definitely an author who I like to read in autumn. I feel like novels like this, where they have such atmosphere and suspense, really lend themselves to being read in this season. This follows Philip, who he was orphaned at a young age, so he was brought up by his cousin Ambrose, kind of very much like a little boys' club in this little manor house that they live in. But every winter, Ambrose goes to the continent for his health, and while there, he meets this woman called Rachel. They get married, he falls ill, and then he dies. But Philip receives these letters from him that make him grow increasingly concerned because Ambrose is convinced that Rachel is trying to kill him. Unfortunately, Philip is too late to do anything about it. By the time he gets there, Ambrose has died. But then Rachel comes to visit the estate, and then this kind of goes from there. This is very much a novel where we are playing around with the ideas of people's responses to Rachel. So before he meets her, Philip detests Rachel. There's an element of jealousy there. There's also an element of mistrust because of these letters he's received from Ambrose. But when he meets Rachel, he's completely taken over by her. He gets swept up in her. And Rachel is very much like an enigmatic figure in this. She has an allure, she has a magnetism, people inherently like her. And it really reminded me of Rebecca, which is Daphne du Maurier's most famous novel and one of my favourite books of all time. Because Rebecca is a text where we follow Maxim de Winter's second wife, who is haunted by the presence of Rebecca, whom everyone appeared to love. So having another novel that has this woman at the heart of it who we're not quite sure what her character was, but everyone is drawn to her. It really felt like this was in some ways in conversation with Rebecca and in some ways like a reflection of Rebecca. Like these are both novels that focus on these women that we have uncertainties about but are somehow irresistibly drawn to. It's just we have a slightly different lens each time. In Rebecca we have this person who is living in the shadow of this figure trying to uncover about them, and in this we're following Philip, and as he is like drawn to this woman, but also we as readers are not sure if he should trust her or if she is entirely trustworthy and all of the untrustworthy things are incorrect. So I very much enjoyed the process that this went through of you as a reader trying to decide where you fall on Rachel. And also, I feel like Daphne du Maurier is so good at creating atmosphere. Rebecca has Mandalay. We are also centered around sort of an estate here. This house that has a very much got a presence in the text, and it's almost like a character of its own, like this estate and the people who make it up and that kind of thing. I really enjoyed just being suspicious. I really enjoyed the atmosphere that built up. I really liked the ending. I will say occasionally I had moments where this dragged a little bit for me, and I think that's just because the very nature of this kind of story is that it's not one that has a huge amount of driving plot. We're just kind of like following these people and trying to work out like what is right, like who is good, who is bad, that kind of thing. So occasionally there were moments where I was like just like having a lovely time but not like super gripped. But the ending I really liked, and I feel like it leaves you with a lot of questions, and I like that. Definitely a du Maurier that I really liked. She has done a couple of books that I've just really not enjoyed, so I'm always really thrilled when it turns out to be one that I do really enjoy. So yeah, definitely a good one to kick off the autumnal reading with. After that, I read The ABC Murders by Agatha Christie. This is a Poirot novel. I had a really fun time with this. There is specifically this edition, which by the way is gorgeous. Let's just take a minute. Acknowledge that. Yes, absolutely stunning. But in the introduction, there is a really interesting quotation. This novel appears to have sprung from a quotation by G.K. Chesterton's, one of their paradoxes, which is, "Where to hide a tree but in a forest, where to hide a cross but in a sea of crosses." I don't think it's a spoiler to read you that quotation and tell you that that influenced this novel, because I really enjoyed reading this with that in mind. So, the ABC murders, essentially, Poirot receives a letter from someone who signs it off at ABC, essentially like mocking him, calling him out, being like, "Oh, you think you're such a good detective, ha 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 ha." In a town that begins with a person whose name begins with A is murdered. In a town that begins with B, a person whose name begins with B is murdered, and so on, ABC. We're following Poirot as he is attempting to solve this, but what I really loved about it is, reading it with that quotation in mind, there is the awareness that where do you hide a murder within a string of murders? So if you take your start point as, we apparently have an ABC alphabeticized murder arrangement happening, where multiple murders, we're working our way through the alphabet, one of these has to be different from the others in that it is the one that is planned. You know, like, where do you hide a deliberate murder within a string of other murders that give you a cover? And if you take that as your start point, attempting to figure out which murder it is, and then after that, who that means the guilty party is, was so much fun. I had such a great time reading this. I always enjoy Agatha Christie's. I just find her, like, consistently fun. But particularly with this one, like, I never work them out. I never do. But sometimes that process is hampered by, like, you know, murders, sometimes things are revealed and you're like, I would have no way of knowing this. None of the information I needed was available to me. Whereas in this one, I felt like I had, if I had put it all together, I could have called it. I had, like, sneaking suspicions. Yeah, this is essentially to say that Agatha Christie I always enjoy, but this one in particular, I did have a really fun time, like, piecing all the things together and just, like, observing from a narrative storytelling point of view. If you take that as your start point, where can you go? How can you play around with it? I just had such a fun time. Next up, I actually DNF'd one of the books, and I'm a bit disappointed in it, but I don't think this is a terrible book. I think some people will like this. I think this is a novel that has things about it that mean it doesn't work for me. So, this is Gossip from the Forest, The Tangled Roots of Our Forest and Fairy Tales by Sara Maitland. This is essentially looking at the link between fairy tales and forests, which on the tin of it sounds like such a me thing. I DNF'd this because it was annoying me. It won't annoy everyone. So, every chapter of this is Sara Maitland visiting a different forest. She's kind of, like, telling you about her trip there, interweaving it with, like, history, talking about fairy tales and how they are linked to forests and that kind of thing. I think essentially why I got annoyed is that Sara Maitland exclusively, the forests that she visits in this are either English or Scottish, but she exclusively talks about Grimm's fairy tales. And if she'd have just said at the start, like, I'm a Grimm's fairy tale scholar, so I will only be talking about those, I'd have been like, fine, lovely. Actually, she goes, Britain is inherently Germanic because the Anglo-Saxons were from Germany, therefore I'm only going to talk about Grimm's fairy tales, because she essentially, like, dismisses all other types of fairy tales from the British Isles as not being as relevant as the Grimm's fairy tales. And that annoyed me, because English as a spoken language might be very Germanic, but there are other languages spoken on this big hunk of earth that are not Germanic. Look at Welsh, look at Scots Gaelic. Like, that fundamentally annoyed me, especially because she's, like, going around Scottish forests, and I'm like, and then in addition to that, she did just have a tendency to make some, like, sweeping statements that also kind of irked me. Additionally, I did notice, like, some errors in this, like, really basic ones, like, she calls out Tolkien for not having any women in his stories, but she, like, misspells his name, and there were some other things that were just wrong, like, she got some dates wrong and stuff like this, and it made me suspicious. You know when, like, the information you already know, you're like, hang on a biscuit, that's not correct. That then makes me suspicious of all the information that she's telling me that I didn't already know, because I don't know how much I can trust it. And essentially, I think there will be lots of people who adore this book, and I love the concept of this book. The actual execution of it, I found myself getting annoyed by, and then I was like, why am I reading a book that is annoying me? So I don't want to like absolutely slam this book because I think there will be a lot of people who will love this. And if you did love this, I do understand it. I'm not like coming out and being like I think this is terrible, because I'm not. It's just I've reached a point where I'm like, why would I continue with the book that it's annoying me? I might keep it for a bit and maybe return to it like a bit later, dip back in and think, and maybe if I'm not trying to read like the whole thing in one go, I might like let these things slide a bit more. I like fairy tale things. I have a whole shelf of fairy tale related things, but a lot of the stuff I like is stuff like the Celtic folk tales and that kind of thing. So I think inherently coming into this and having a whole swathe of folktales and fairy tales that I personally really like just being dismissed as not being relevant enough to talk about is just, it automatically sets me up to like not wholly enjoy this book. I have friends who have this book. Miriam, hope you like it. I'm sure you will. But I just took a view. So, you know, onwards and upwards. After that, I thought I would go for something completely different. So I read The Broken Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin, which is the second book of the Inheritance trilogy. As it is the second book, I'm going to talk about it in a spoiler-free way, which is in some ways very achievable because this follows a completely different person than the first book did. We're following Ori, who is a blind artist. She's blind, but she can essentially like see magic. That's not necessarily something she wants to advertise to some of the like people in charge. So she's like trying to keep that on the down low. There's this guy that she's like taken into her home who appears to be homeless. He doesn't seem to talk. He has some like weird stuff going on, but in taking him into her home, she essentially brings a lot of stuff upon herself. Like, these actions have a lot of consequences, and these consequences are kind of geared around, there are godlings who are not like full-on gods, but they're like the children of gods, and someone is murdering them. So this is in some ways kind of like a murder mystery, because we're trying to figure out who is killing these godlings, and how, because is that something that's even possible? It's also like very much time has passed since the end of the first book. We are following this different character, but we are still exploring all the ramifications of the end of the first book. So I won't go into that too much so as to not spoil things, but there's definitely a lot happening here to do with power struggles. Like, things have changed a lot from the end of the first book, and there are different factions that are trying to like engineer their rise to power or bring down other people, like that kind of thing. So as with the first book, I really enjoyed all of these like political machination kind of things. Ori was an interesting main character. Her ability to see magic is very interesting. Also, sometimes it did feel a little bit convenient. I think essentially like this was kind of the same with Yane in the first book, but I feel like I noticed it more with this being the second book. Is Ori kind of in some ways is a bit of a passive figure to be following. A lot of the time she's kind of just like swept up in events, and she's not necessarily like making active decisions about things. The plus side of that is that this is such a easy book to just like zoom through because there's just always stuff happening. The downside is that sometimes I felt I wasn't 100% sure on like Ori as a person. I think I found it easier to connect with Yane in the first book because she has all of this stuff that she's working through to do with like the death of her mother and like attempting to like manage all these political machinations and that kind of thing. Whereas Ori very much like, although she is also dealing with her own grief from the death of her father and that kind of thing, I don't know, it was just like, I definitely like noticed the kind of repeat of that, and I think that was slightly exacerbated by the fact that I wasn't super invested in this sort of like romantic plot that was happening in this, which again, I also wasn't hugely invested in the first book, but again, some elements of it felt a little bit similar, so I think just like having it for a second time, I don't know. That's not to say I didn't enjoy this book. I love N.K. Jemisin as a writer. I find her so readable. I find the stories she tells so interesting, the way she tells them so fabulous. So there was a lot I liked about this. I really did enjoy seeing how things have changed. I'm definitely going to be reading the next book. I think the next book is going to bring together a lot of stuff, and I'm really excited for that. So definitely a series that I am really enjoying. I just think that there was a little bit of elements that in the first book were maybe not necessarily my hugely favourite elements have like been repeated. But, you know. The next book I read on my Kindle, and that was The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. I was interested in reading this because I know it is like the first like detective novel kind of book, and that was just like an interesting like genre thing that I wanted to check out. And also I read The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins a couple of years ago in autumn, and although I felt like it was a very long book, I did enjoy, like, the process of it. I kind of feel the same way about this. This was also a chunky boy, and I listened to some of it on audiobook. I've only listened to 2 audiobooks in my life, and they have both been Wilkie Collins, but I think it really helps. So this is telling the story of the Moonstone, which is this massive diamond that was like stolen from this shrine in India, and it's said to have a curse on it, and we're essentially following it as it makes its way to this particular family, and it's gifted to this girl on her birthday, and then the next day it goes missing. And we're trying to solve the mystery of, like, who has taken this diamond. There are these 3 Indian men who follow the diamond, who are very much trying to get it back. There are a number of characters in the house. Everyone is suspicious, but the narrative setup of it is that you go between different narrators, and they're all writing down their part of the story, and it's very much like they're writing it down after it's happened, and they keep saying, like, oh, I have to write this down how I remember it at the time. I'm not allowed to add anything with my knowledge of how the events unfolded. So you very much, like, piece together this story, and it's a bit of a beast. I do think at times that this could have been a little bit shorter, but I also did have a fun time seeing this unfold. I think that listening to the audiobook really helped. The first narrator, who is kind of like the butler of this household, I read all of that myself, and then the second narrator, who is this woman, she's the cousin of the girl who received the diamond, and she's very much like a church busybody. And I'm glad I listened to her section on audiobook, because one of the main things about this novel is that the people who in it are such characters. So I think I would have found that second narrator a little bit tedious to read, but I actually really enjoyed listening to her, because she's so, she's like it was comically hilarious how every single interaction she has with these people is just based around her trying to slip them these little religious tracts and these little pamphlets that she has. At one point, like, she knows that this person is seriously ill, and so she's sneaking around their household, putting all of these little pamphlets into any possible place that they could find them, so as to, like, save her immortal soul. And it was actually, like, very funny. But also the same thing with the first narrator. Like, that butler he's very, like, I wouldn't like him if I met him as a person, but he is an interesting character to be reading a story from a perspective of. He has little, like, foibles and that kind of thing. So I think one thing that Wilkie Collins did so well is these sort of these people who are, like, almost comically absurd in how far they go with some of these, like, personality traits, but in a way that is not like, it's not like a barrel of laughs, but, like, it's just humour at the edges, and I really liked that. I am actually really proud, because I 100% called who stole the diamond, and I don't do that very often, but in this time I was like, I had my suspicions, and I was right, and I was really pleased. Although I predicted the who, I did not predict the how, because I don't see how you could, because there were so many twists and turns in this, and it was just like, what about this? What about this? And I was just like, wow, what is happening? So on the whole, I definitely, again, this is another one that I think I could definitely see people getting very bored with, because it is such a long novel, but I really enjoyed. I had, like, a really fun time, and I enjoyed reading it as, like, an example of genre. You know, like, detective fiction is something that we have so much of now, but this was very much like one of, if not the first, like, real examples of that, and it was really interesting to read from, like, a genre point of view as well. The final book I read for my spooky season reading was Dracul by Dacre, Stoker and J.D. Barker, inspired by the notes Dracula's creator left behind. So essentially, the original draft of Dracula was a very different novel. It got massively rewritten by Bram Stoker. So what Dacre, Stoker and J.D. Barker have done is they're essentially taking a lot of liberties with Bram Stoker's life. So we're following Bram as a character, and this is essentially positing, like, what if Dracula was in fact based on true experiences that Bram Stoker had. So if you're prepared to suspend your disbelief of actually vampires being real and involved in this, I had a rollicking good time. It's another one that's a bit of a chunk, and I at times did feel like it could be shorter. but it is also another one that is told through lots of different means. So our essential like overarching setup is that we have like now, which is Bram in this tower. There is something behind the door that he cannot let out. He has armed himself with holy water, with a rifle, with stuff like this. And then as that narrative goes on, there's also someone outside the tower who he cannot let in. So we have Bram on this like feeling like never-ending night of endurance. And then we flash back, and then we piece together how he got here through lots of different things. So we piece together through his journal, through letters that his sister Matilda is writing, through his brother's journal, and you piece together how they got here, and it all is based around this nanny they had as a child called Ellen, who cured Bram of this illness he had. And then and she disappears one day, but then in these times, one of them is convinced that they've seen her, and she hasn't aged a day. Can you see where this might be going? So I really enjoyed learning more about Bram Stoker's actual life. Like, obviously, like, take it with a pinch of salt. The vampire stuff, probably not real. But, like, the actual, like, what was Bram's life like was super duper interesting. Also, like, moments of this were so, like, there were chilling moments in this. Like, when he's in the tower is so suspenseful, but equally, like, other moments to do with, like, vampires and stuff like this in this, like, were really creepy, and so I felt like it did that really, really well. And because you constantly have this, like, source of suspense, like, as you creep towards how he got there, you start to develop an idea of why he is there and what is happening. If you have read Dracula, like, a lot of beats in this are, I think, designed to sort of be in that way where they're like suggesting, like, if this happened, this could be the inspiration for this aspect of the original novel. So it does mean that you reading it do have an idea of where this is going, because like, there is a woman character who might be going a bit mad, but she has these weird little like puncture wounds on her, like, what character could that be like, and that kind of thing. So essentially, like, I really enjoy these novels that are interacting with Dracula, and it is particularly interesting to have it done with Bram Stoker's life interwoven through it as well. So definitely one that I enjoyed, and I think it was a good spooky one to end on, because I'm recording this on Halloween weekend, and it's definitely really like set the tone. That's everything that I read for my little spooky season TBR. I would love to hear if you've read any of these. I would really like to hear your thoughts on them. If you have been doing your own spooky season reading, like, what did you pick up? Are there any things you'd recommend for me to bear in mind for next year? Because I pretty much always do this now, so I would always welcome recommendations. But otherwise, I hope you've had a really lovely October and a super duper lovely day, and I will see you next time for something different.